Welcome, everyone. It is good to see everybody on this Friday afternoon. We're just going to give it a minute or so to let everybody get joined into the room, get their audio connected, and then we'll go ahead and get started with our presentation. Okay, and then before we get started, I just want to go over some housekeeping here. Many of you have joined many Zoom sessions and webinars in the past, so you're very familiar with this. But just to recap, this is a webinar, so your mic has already been muted. If you need to read through the live captions, you can go ahead and click on the live transcription option at the bottom. We also have interpreters here available as well today. If at any time you want to ask any questions throughout the presentation, you have the opportunity to click on the Q&A button, and those questions will be fielded to us on the panel, and we'll be able to ask those to Mary Ann, who is our presenter today. Some of you may not feel comfortable asking questions, for fear of what your colleagues might think of you. I want you to know this is a safe space, but we understand that. So if you want to ask that question anonymously, you have the option to do so here. This is your time to ask those questions. In order for us to have growth and get more comfortable in conversations like these, we really need to have a space to be able to ask those questions. So I thank you for your vulnerability and also your willingness to participate today. The chat will be disabled and enabled at certain times for interaction. If Mary Ann wants to get some feedback, we'll go ahead and open that up for you to be able to for you to be able to either chat or ask those questions verbally. Just a reminder, this webinar is being recorded, so you will be able to watch it later on. We will post it on our professional development YouTube channel, and you can share it with your colleagues as well. So that is our housekeeping, and then I think we are ready to start. Susie, whenever you're ready. Awesome. Okay, so again, welcome everybody. It's good to see you here at this Friday afternoon. I know we're all probably getting ready for spring break soon. So in addition to the housekeeping rules that we went over, just to give a little bit of background about what this series is going to entail, if this is your first time. Each year, our Classified Senate for Fresno City and the district office develop annual goals for all of our senators and our members to work on throughout the year. This year, our number one goal was to demonstrate a commitment to anti-racism. And in order to attain that goal, we collaborated with our faculty here at Fresno City, our Student Equity Committee, and then our senators to bring you a series of seminars to really just promote student equity, anti-racism strategies, and really just examine the historical context of race, terminology, and definition so we could all have a shared understanding and then move forward to better assist our students here. So while we're excited to bring you this series once a month on Fridays, usually in the afternoon, we also realize that it's kind of bittersweet, right? We're bringing these because of what's happening in the world today. And that's scary, but we're in this together to help our students. So we want to provide you with these professional development opportunities so that we can recognize where our students are coming from, what challenges and barriers they may face, and just what some of their life circumstances are. So with that, I'm going to give a quick introduction. If for those of you who don't know me, my name is Andrea Torres. I work at Fresno City and sit on Classified Senate. We also have Miss Susie Nitzel here, who's our Classified Senate President. And we have Nylene Clark and Tiffany Martinez, who are also senators and classified professionals here at Fresno City. So welcome to our series titled, or our seminar today titled, The Psychology of Racial Prejudice and Discrimination. Our speaker today is Miss Marianne Valentino. For those of you who do not know her and have had the pleasure of meeting her, she is a faculty member here who teaches psychology. She is also our Academic Senate President, and she is also the facilitator for our RAM-REL, or our RAM Racial Equity Lab series, which is more professional development geared specifically for classified professionals. So again, this is for you, just you. We did turn managers away, we turned faculty away. This is specifically for our classified professionals. So Miss Marianne, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, one correction. I am not the Academic Senate president.
I'm so sorry.
I'm the Academic Senate past president. So I was the president, but I am currently ending my term as the past president. So in May, I'll be able to finally be out of that leadership position. It's been great, but I'm ready to leave. Let's see. So let me share my screen. And now that I've done that, I no longer see the chat or the Q&A feature. So I won't be looking at that, but we've got classified professionals who are monitoring that for me. Let's see. So I think we should just get right into it. Let me start by saying that being equity minded and embracing an anti-racist mindset is a journey, right? And so we're all maybe at different places in that journey, but that journey kind of starts with you, and it starts with your willingness to self-reflect and examine where you fit into these concepts, these ideas that we're going to be talking about, and that you'll continue to talk about as part of this series. And then maybe you'll decide to sign up for the RAM Racial Equity Lab, and that will create a space for even more inquiry and understanding. I want to start with a poem in order to provide a framework for what we're going to be doing today. And this is called Invitation to Brave Space by Mickey Scott Bay Jones. She's a motivational speaker. Together, we will create brave space, because there is no such thing as a safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars, and we all have caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of our outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. This space will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together. And we will work on it side by side. I was reflecting today about some missteps that I've taken, some mistakes that I've made in the facilitation of the Interdisciplinary Faculty Lab. And it reminded me that we're all doing this work together, and that I am a learner myself, right? I'm learning myself. I'm not an expert in equity or anti-racism. I'm learning myself. So I am learning with you, and I will learn from you, right, as we have conversations about this work that we're doing. And we can only do that if we have courageous conversations and create brave spaces in which to do that. Okay, so the title is an introduction to the psychology of racial prejudice and discrimination. Carla Kirk, if you were here for her wonderful presentation, or if you watched the taping of that, she provided a lot of wonderful definitions. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on definitions, but I'm going to review the definitions of stereotype, prejudice, and discrimination. If we were in a room together, I would have you share that out. But since we're not really like physically in a room together, and we're in a webinar format, I'm just going to go ahead and provide you with little brief definitions and examples to make sure that we're all on the same page with those definitions. So let's start with stereotypes. So stereotype is an oversimplified idea of people based on their group membership. Now, I'm sure you could all come up with a long list of stereotypes that you've heard about the groups that you are part of and other groups, these oversimplified ideas. Sometimes when we think about stereotypes, we think that they are always that they always have a kind of judgment attached to them, but sometimes stereotypes are quite benign. So like African Americans are religious. There's not necessarily a judgment behind that. There could be if someone has a prejudice against religiousness, religiosity, or a prejudice for that, there could be. But the stereotype in and of itself isn't necessarily laden with judgment. Or Mexican people like spicy food, right? There's not necessarily any judgment behind that. So stereotypes don't necessarily have some judgment behind them. It doesn't necessarily mean that they don't cause harm. So even if they seem kind of benign, like African Americans are religious, could still cause harm because there's an assumption made about a person based on their group affiliation. So the African American who's atheist, right, you can cause some harm to that person by making an assumption that they're religious. I suppose if you invited somebody over who was Mexican and you assume they like spicy food and they don't like to eat spicy food, then you could cause harm that way too. Prejudice is judgment laden, right? So a favorable or unfavorable attitude based on group membership. And normally we think about unfavorable attitudes, but you could be prejudiced toward a particular group as well as prejudice against a particular group. So for example, Asian people are good students. There's a sort of favorable attitude about Asian people being good students. Again, just because there's a favorable attitude doesn't mean that that can't cause harm, right? Even a favorable attitude can cause harm. Or African Americans are lazy. So there you see there's a stereotype there and a prejudice on top of that stereotype, which is an attitude toward the group based on the stereotype. And then discrimination goes a step further, and now you're looking at behavior. So differential treatment based on membership in a particular group. So to use my same example, a teacher who spends more time with the white or the Asian students is engaging in differential treatment based on a prejudice, which is based on a stereotype, right? So you can kind of see how they all kind of fit together. And now that teacher that spends more time with the white and the Asian students because they believe they're better students is actually setting themselves up for self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Those students are likely to do better in their class because they're getting more attention, because they're getting more instruction. And so then their prejudice and their stereotype gets confirmed. But we'll talk more about confirmation bias later. And the employer, who rarely, if ever, hires an African American employee, is discriminating against the African Americans based on their prejudiced attitude of African Americans are lazy. prejudice can lead to discrimination, but not necessarily, right? So somebody could have a prejudiced attitude and keep it in check. Maybe they're going to keep it in check because for legal reasons, or maybe some other reason. So they don't necessarily always go together, although the literature often confabulates them. So you'll sometimes see in the literature an article about prejudice, but they're really talking about discrimination, or an article about discrimination when they're really talking about prejudice. So one is the attitude and one is the behavior. Okay, so what are some explanations for prejudice and discrimination? Right? I'll kind of confabulate them. We're going to see that. So we're going to look at, I don't know, I think it's 4 or 5 of the major explanations for prejudice and discrimination in the literature that have been researched and have some evidence to support them. And then at the very end, we're also going to be talking about some ways that we can combat prejudice and discrimination, some things that we can do to overcome prejudice and discrimination. So the first one that I'd like to talk about is social dominance orientation. This is prejudice toward low status groups in order to maintain a social hierarchy. Now, it's important to note that this can be a kind of personality style, the social dominance orientation. That is that people can adhere to this idea that this is how it should be, that there is a social order, and that people should be in their place, right? So that's the social dominance orientation, that there is a hierarchy. And for some people, they would assert that there should be a hierarchy, that the hierarchy provides social structure, it transmits roles, it transmits power. And so people and cultures, societies will work kind of hard in order to maintain that hierarchy. We've seen this in our own culture. We see this in dehumanizing people of color, to keep them in their place, using white as the ideal at the top of the hierarchy. If you Google search social dominance orientation, you'll get, as like one of the first visuals, you'll get this ancient Egypt online pyramid with the pharaoh at the top, and then the government officials underneath that, and the soldiers and the scribes and the merchants and the craftsmen, and at the bottom the enslaved. And this was the social structure. So as we're moving through this, I'd like you to be kind of contemplating the social dominance orientation of our culture, right? If we were to sit down together and create a pyramid, what might that look like? And what are the social structures that keep it in place? Last night at the Stand with Asians table talk, Michael Takeda, who is our Academic Senate President-elect, so in May, he will become the Academic Senate President and do his 2-year term. He wrote this in the chat, and it immediately made me think of how we produce and maintain group-based social hierarchies in our culture. It reminded me of social dominance orientation. So I emailed him and I asked him if I could use his quote as an example, and he gave me permission to do so. So this is what he wrote last night in the chat. Asian lives have always been cheap. By cheapening Asian lives, it makes it easier for those in power to exclude us, kick us out, intern us, normalize war atrocities, kill us, ridicule us, scapegoat us, ignore us, etc. Right? This is that hierarchy with people of color at the lower level of the hierarchy. And he beautifully provided an example of of how that fits in with our culture. So, what are the major elements that produce and maintain group-based social hierarchies? So, one of those is legitimizing myths that legitimize the social hierarchy. So, these are things like white supremacy, right? That legitimizes the myth that there is, in fact, uh, something at the top, right? And then the lower levels all the way down. Nationalism is a legitimizing myth that it is best to be American, right? That's what we're all striving to be, Americans, whatever that means, right? Um, the myth of meritocracy. The myth of meritocracy is this idea that there's a just world, and if you work hard enough, you will get to the top, right? This American dream, that everyone is open to the American dream, that we all have equal opportunity. We all have equal opportunity if you just work hard enough. That legitimizes the social structure, right? You could get to the top if you just work hard enough to get to the top. And I could come up with other legitimizing myths, and if we had time to ponder it all together, you could come up with other legitimizing myths. There are also hierarchy enhancing social policies. What are the social policies that maintain the hierarchy? So some examples of those would be restrictive immigration policies. And from last night's presentation, I think it was Jack talked about Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, right? That these kinds of policies enhance the social hierarchy. They maintain that social hierarchy. Penalties for criminal activity help to maintain the social hierarchy. There's a lot of data looking at prejudice and discrimination in the criminal justice system. And all things being equal, right? Same crime, same everything, that Black African Americans have are more likely to be convicted, more likely to have longer sentences, more likely to have death penalty sentencing. So penalties for criminal activity, differential treatment there helps to maintain the social hierarchy. Practices like redlining help to maintain the social hierarchy. So going back to that myth of meritocracy, right? Everybody has the same opportunities. Well, they don't really all have the same opportunities when we have redlining, when people that live in certain communities are less likely to be able to qualify for a housing loan, right? They're able to buy a home. And Fresno certainly has a long history of redlining that we still see the effects of today. Oh, so that was the first one, social dominance orientation to explain prejudice and discrimination. Second is realistic conflict and the myth of the zero-sum game. So this is the idea that prejudice arises from competition. So when groups are now competing with each other, and that might be for real or perceived scarce resources or benefits, right? Not necessarily real, but it might be perceived. So now there's this sort of us and them, and if there's only so much to go around, then of course I want more for my group, right? And now there's a conflict between my group and your group, right? This us versus them. The zero-sum game is this idea that there is in fact only so much to go around, right? There's a pie, and we're going to divide up the pie. And so it has to sum up to the whole. So if I get 20, then somebody has to lose 20 because there's only so much to go around. That's the myth of the zero-sum game, that there's only so much. Dr. Kamara Phyllis Jones, who's at Morehouse School of Medicine, used this wonderful analogy about the myth of the zero-sum game that I'm going to share. She says that it's kind of like a potluck. Oh, I think I have a potluck. There it is, the potluck. Kind of, if we think about this as a potluck, that the myth of zero-sum game is that there's only so much food at our potluck. So if we invite more people to our potluck, we're going to run out of food. Without realizing that if you invite more people to your potluck, they're going to bring more food. And because that's a potluck, right? That's what you do in a potluck. You bring food with you. So not only are they going to bring more food, but they're going to bring more different kinds of food, more variety of food. So the more people that we invite to the potluck, the richer the potluck is. Right? They're not going to come and eat up our food and we're going to have less. They're actually going to come and bring more variety of food. So our potluck is going to be richer. The third explanation for prejudice is simple conformity, that prejudice is supported by dominant social norms that are maintained through simple public apathy. We're just kind of going along with the way that things have always been done. Now, I am a person who loves to look at like old classic studies and then ponder what it means for us in modern life. So I want to present a study that was done in the 1950s. I'm also just really fascinated by these old studies and just some of the creativity and how they were able to gather some data. So this is from the early 1950s. The researchers looked at the behavior of Black and white miners in a southern United States. So I think they were coal miners. So they're going down into the coal mines, which is dangerous work, right? So when they are below ground, they're a team. They're miners, right? And they're working as a team. And it's dangerous work. So they have to watch each other's back and right, they have to do that. So they looked at their behaviors, the Black and white miners, particularly they're looking at how the white miners are treating the Black miners underground. And they had a rating sheet, for rating discriminatory behavior. And what they found was that the social norm underneath the ground, right, in the mine, was to be friendly toward each other. And that on the rating scale, they determined that 80% of the white miners were friendly toward the Black miners in the mine. And then they watched them when they came out and interacted above ground, out of the mine. And above ground, the 80% friendliness dropped to 20% friendliness. Their behaviors toward the Black miners changed really dramatically. So the conclusion that they came to was whether or not prejudice is shown depends on the social context within which behavior takes place. That the white miners were conforming to different norms above and below ground. And so I really want us to be thinking about that. Like, what are the norms in certain contexts, right? There's norms in the context of our family. Right? Do we behave differently when we're around our family members with regard to how we talk about people of various races, how we interact with people of various races? Is that different than when we're at work, right? Is that different than when we're, all of our different social contexts? And are we displaying a certain amount of apathy, conformity in certain contexts? Stereotyping. So prejudice arises when stereotypes lead to social categorization. And really, that's what stereotypes do, right? Sort of by their very nature. They are a way of social categorization. When we start to do that, when we start to put people in social categories, then we begin to have an in-group and an out-group, right? My in-groups are all the groups to which I identify. Um, and that then sets up an us versus them kind of mentality. So I belong to many social groups, right? I am middle-aged. I am cisgender female. I am Italian American descent. I am married. All of these things are social groups that then set up this in-group versus out-group, right? So you are young and I am middle-aged, or you're old and I'm middle-aged. You're cisgender male and I'm cisgender female. Right? All of these sort of us versus them begin to emerge. And what we see with that is that people have a tendency to exaggerate the differences between the groups. So um, Asians are good at math and African Americans are not good at math, right? Sort of exaggerating the difference based on the stereotype. And then exaggerating the similarities within groups, especially the outgroup. So we do have this tendency to see the in-group as being more diverse because I'm looking at myself as a woman, as an Italian American, and I'm going to say, well, I'm not like all women. Right? So all women are not the same. But there is this tendency to lump the other as all together. So you'll hear people, you'll hear, I'll use women as an example. You'll hear women saying things about men, like, oh, men are like this, right? When they will likely, more likely, acknowledge that there's diversity within their own group. Not all women are the same, but men are all the same. Right? So that kind of exaggerating the differences between the groups and exaggerating the similarities within the out group. And this gets entrenched by something called the confirmation bias. So let's take a closer look at what the confirmation bias is. So the confirmation bias is the tendency people have to seek, interpret, and remember information that confirms their preconceptions. A confirmation bias happens when people give more weight to evidence that confirms their hypothesis and undervalue evidence that disproves it. So it's right in the name. It confirms our bias, right? We confirm our biases. So I'll give you an example from my own experience. I was talking with a family member. We were chit-chatting with a family member. And she was telling me that she had gone to lunch with her friends, and there was a table nearby of African Americans, and they were really loud. And what she said was, why are they always so loud? Right? This stereotype, African Americans are loud. Why are they always so loud? So loud. So I chose to try to disrupt that confirmation bias. And actually, what I chose to do was try to educate her about what confirmation bias is. So I said, so are you saying that you've never been in a restaurant where there were a group of African Americans who weren't loud? And she kind of had to stop and think about that. I said, could it be possible that you just didn't notice? You didn't notice the non-loud groups because it's the loud groups that stick out. So she kind of thought about that. And then I said, and have you never been in a restaurant where there was a loud table and they weren't African American, a loud white group or a loud whatever, other group other than African Americans. And she had to say, yeah, right? Yeah, she's been in a restaurant where there were loud groups. I think I said, I've been the loud group, right? Me and my friends together have sometimes gotten loud and had to be like, oh, right, we're the loud group right now. Maybe we need to stop laughing so hard. Um, so I was trying to get her to see her confirmation bias. Now I know with myself as an instructor that I have to catch myself, right? I have stereotypes about people too. I have my own unconscious biases, and sometimes I will catch myself having a thought about a student, like I'm making an assumption about that student based on my perceived notions of what groups they belong to. And I have to stop and be like, oh, I'm doing it, right? Um, I am making all kinds of assumptions based on some stereotype of that student. Maybe it's because they're young, right? It could be because of their racial group. It could be because of the way they're dressed. All of these kinds of things. Am I just confirming my own bias? Right? So challenging myself. That's what we need to be doing. We need to be challenging ourselves. And I'm hoping that as we become a community, right, we're Rams, that we get comfortable challenging each other. So our social identity provides us with a sense of self, right, based on that group membership. And if you look on the wheel, you can see some examples of social identity. And this leads to, or can lead to, in-group favoritism. My group is better than your group. And that's in-group favoritism. And I really wanted to make sure that I took the opportunity to talk about minimal group paradigm. This is Tafel's work, and his name will be on the next slide. Tafel wanted to know, what's the smallest amount of difference between two groups that he could create in the laboratory that would lead to discriminatory behavior. So we see discriminatory behavior between groups where there's kind of obvious differences between the groups, like males and females. So we have sexism, right? And between whites and African Americans and Asians and right, the racial groups. So based on race, Tafel wanted to know, would we see in-group favoritism with not so obvious and really kind of insignificant differences between the groups? And that might not be making any sense at all right now. I'll show you what he did, and then it'll make more sense. So he did a series of experiments. So there's lots of different experiments that he did. And he got real complicated with the experiment. So I'm just going to give you a little taste of Tafel's work. And if you want a particular article, I could send it to you, or you can look it up and look up some of his particular work. So what I'm going to present is one of his original research paradigms. And I'm not exactly sure why he chose to work with 14 and 15-year-old boys, but his original work was with 14 and 15-year-old boys. And right now, I'm not even remembering how many there were, but it was a fair enough sample of teenage boys. And he showed them some slides. So he showed them some Kandinsky slides and some Klee slides, and he asked them to rate them, like which ones do you like and which ones do you hate? And he actually made sure beforehand that they weren't boys that were familiar with art. So he did some sort of pre-assessment and determined that they weren't boys who were going to know who Kandinsky and Klee were to begin with. So he showed them these slides, and these are Kandinsky and these are Klee slides. Which one do you like better? And then he told them that they were either a person who, a boy who loved Kandinsky or a boy who loved Klee. He was lying to them. He wasn't using the actual data. He randomly assigned them to be a Kandinsky lover or a Klee lover. And these were boys who knew each other. So he randomly assigned them. He didn't tell them which group they were in together, right? So they got their results individually. You're a Kandinsky lover and you're a Klee lover. And then he put them in a situation where they had the opportunity to award points to the other boys. And they were just given numbers. So, because he was well aware that they would probably just want to give points to their friends, regardless of being Kandinsky or Klee lovers, because whether they were friends would override this group membership, right? So the boys don't know anything about who they're awarding points to with regard to their names. You know, is that their friend or not their friend? They just know this boy is a Kandinsky lover or this boy is a Klee lover, and then they know which group they're in. Okay, so that's the situation. And they could award lots of different ranges of points. I'm just going to show you 3 examples. So in one example, they could award the in-group. So let's say that the boy is a Kandinsky lover, and now they're being told, okay, this is a Kandinsky lover. You can award that person 19 points. If you award that boy 19 points, then you automatically must award the Klee lover 25 points. Okay. Or you could award the Kandinsky lover 13 points and the Klee lover also 13 points, so equal amount of points. Or you could award the Kandinsky lover 7 points, and then you'll automatically give 1 point to the Klee lover. So you have an interesting setup here, because the way to award the in-group, the most amount of points that you can give your in-group, 19 points, that's the most amount of points that you can give to your fellow Kandinsky lover. But in order to do that, you have to give the out-group even more points, 25 points, right? So that's an interesting kind of dilemma. Or they could do equal amount of points, or they could give the most disparity, like 6-point disparity, but giving the most points, I'm sorry, more points to the in-group. So hopefully you're following that. And so what he found was that most of the boys chose the 7-to-1. They chose to give their Kandinsky loving compatriots the least amount of points that they could give them, 7, in order to not give the Klee lovers points, right? Just 1 point to those darn Klee lovers, right? So this, and he did variations on this. So if you're interested, you can look at the variations, and there have been some replications that have been pretty interesting. You know, what this really points to is loyalty to seemingly meaningless groups, right? Even when there's no clear benefit from being in that group, right? What's the benefit of being a Klee lover versus a Kandinsky lover? Right? Who cares? Here, who cares? So this is what he was talking about, this minimal group difference. You're a Klee lover or you're a Kandinsky lover. He did another one with estimating the number of dots on the screen. And then he said, oh, you're an exaggerator or you're a minimizer. And he got these same kind of results. When people were told you're a minimizer, they gave more points to the other minimizers and less points to the maximizers, to the exaggerators. Right? This loyalty to meaningless groups. So if if we are willing to have loyalty to meaningless groups, what does this mean for meaningful groups? To our loyalty to meaningful groups. Now, there have been some really interesting replications of this, looking at can little things be done to change loyalty around racial groups? So people will kind of group by race, right? A bit like kind of group by race. But what they have found in some of this research is that if they put baseball caps on people, so now you have red baseball caps kind of randomly assigned, that the racial clicking will kind of disappear and people will group by what color hat they have on. So now all the red hats are together, and now you have this diverse racial group because you've put red hats on very equal number of the racial groups. So now they're all congregated, based on what hat they're wearing instead of based on race. So you can disrupt the grouping by utilizing what we've learned from this, right? Because who cares if you're wearing a red hat? But if wearing a red hat helps people to come together, then you can use that to your benefit to create to change the paradigm, right? Just to get this paradigm shift. I want to also mention self-esteem, because our social identity, our self-esteem gets kind of wrapped up in our social identity. And so we see that with some white supremacy ideology, like I might be poor and I might not be very smart, but at least I'm white, right? That social identity of whiteness can elevate self-esteem when self-esteem isn't there for other reasons. So we get a certain amount of our self-esteem from those social identities, or at least we can get some level of self-esteem from those social identities. Now, I want to make sure that I mention with self-esteem that people who adhere to the social dominance orientation, that there's a hierarchy, particularly people who are at the top of the hierarchy, because they are more likely to adhere to social dominance orientation, that they actually might have an inflated self-esteem, right? That it's not necessarily low self-esteem that perpetuates prejudice and discrimination. Low self-esteem can perpetuate prejudice and discrimination because people can build themselves up through an affiliation with, for example, being the dominant group, right? The white or the male. But you can also have an inflated self-esteem that perpetuates prejudice and discrimination. So those are the major explanations of prejudice and discrimination, all on one page. I wanted to specifically address hate crimes and how they fit into all of this. And I found from the APA website a really beautiful quote that I think just like I can't say it any better. So I'm going to put the quote up there and I'll read it to you in case you can't see it very well, because I know you can read it, but I'll read it to you in case you can't see it very well. What I want you to be thinking about as I'm reading the quote from the American Psychological Association on what leads to hate crime is what elements of these explanations of prejudice can you see in this paragraph on what leads to hate crimes. So thinking about social dominance orientation, realistic conflict, and zero-sum game, conformity, stereotyping, and social categorization, right? Self-esteem, these kinds of things. So keeping all of that in mind as we look at what the APA has to say about what leads to hate crimes. Hate crimes are an extreme form of prejudice made more likely in the context of social and political change. Public and political discourse may devalue members of unfamiliar groups, and offenders may feel that their livelihood or way of life is threatened by demographic changes. Offenders may not be motivated by hate, but rather by fear, ignorance, or anger. These can lead to dehumanization of unfamiliar groups and to targeted aggression. So at this point, I have one more slide, and my last slide is on things that we can do to reduce prejudice. But at this point, I would like to offer at least a couple of people to put their hand up. If you can, somebody is supposed to enable that you can put your hand up, and to talk about where you see evidence of the various reasons that I gave for prejudice and discrimination in this paragraph on what leads to hate crimes.
So Marianne, I've enabled the raised hands. Double checking. Usually people are shy at first, so we'll give it a couple minutes. And I know you don't have a problem sitting in the space and waiting them out.
I don't. I just want to, they should raise their hand if they don't know what I'm asking either. You know, they could raise their hand and just say, I don't know what are you asking us, in case I wasn't clear what I'm asking you to do. Because sometimes that's
Okay,
what the
we've got Anna.
Great.
Anna, go ahead.
Can you explain the question again? Because I am one of the people who was not entirely sure what it was that you were asking.
Yeah, that's what typically happens when there's silence, is no one's quite sure what is she asking us to do. So if we look at this, right, we have some explanations for prejudice and discrimination: social dominance orientation, realistic conflict, conformity, right, just apathy, stereotyping and social categorization, exaggerating us and them, in-group favoritism, self-esteem. So we have some explanations for prejudice. And now we have the APA's quote on what leads to hate crimes. So if we look at this, what leads to hate crimes, can we identify in here examples of those reasons for prejudice and discrimination? Can you point to this and say, oh, this sentence is talking about zero-sum game. Oh, this sentence is talking about social dominance orientation. This sentence is talking about conformity. That's what I'm asking.
Gotcha.
Okay, Anna, go ahead.
Okay, so social dominance for sure for the hate crimes, because we've already seen things like, you know, Jews will not replace us, wanting to be at the top, this idea that, again, the way of life is threatened, for
Yes.
example, livelihood or way of life is being threatened.
Mm-hmm.
And clearly right now with the hate crimes against Asians and Pacific Islanders, fear and ignorance. Like if some of my family are in front of other people, they'd be like, oh, you're Chinese. No, we're not, but you know, and the virus was not made in a lab either. Things like that.
Yes, scapegoating definitely is, and which is something they talked about last night. Scapegoating is used to maintain the hierarchy. Yeah. Thank you.
And we have Deanna, who's coming to us from Madeira. Deanna, go ahead.
Yes, I recognize that one of the explanations of prejudice that I recognize is about the zero-sum game that you talked about in the threatened the threatened livelihood and the demographic changes, that people who think that there is not enough good in the universe to go around, really. And so I recognize that with the question that you asked.
Yeah, so that's fear, right? That's fear and ignorance. It's if we give more of the pie to these people who are asking for more, then that necessarily means that we get less of the pie. Yeah. And fear is a powerful motivator for anger and rage.
Cindy Dunn.
Hi. Okay, I'm seeing this whole political scene with the Republicans and and voter violations of trying to suppress voting rights for people throughout 43 or more states right now, as the social dominance orientation. And with that to me shows hate crime in terms of how they personally hate the thought of losing elections. So they're going to change the rules for the elections. And it's primarily geared toward people of color that they are blocking voting rights for, whereas every American should have voting rights.
Yeah, and you'll hear justifications for it, right? They'll
Oh, yes.
they will justify the voter suppression. They'll say things like, well, they should have an ID. They should be able to get to their polling place on Tuesday, right? All of these, which maintains that social structure. And so then you're seeing policies, right? Going back to what maintains the social dominance orientation are policies. Thank you, Cindy. If there's one more, we could do one more, or I can move on.
Becky has a question, has her hand raised. Go ahead, Becky. Becky, if you're talking, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
3 p.m. Time for.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I was saying, every time there's the mention of unfamiliar groups, I feel like it speaks to the us versus them, already kind of just associating them with, certain values. So like here it says directly, you start to devalue the members of other groups. And again, you start to dehumanize the members of other groups. And that's one of the concepts that stuck out to me.
Yes. And I'm glad that you kind of highlighted the unfamiliar group, right? Devaluing groups you don't even really know, unfamiliar groups. Thank you. So let's talk about what researchers are saying are ways to reduce prejudice and discrimination. So things in the literature that have some evidence to support that they can, in fact, reduce prejudice and discrimination. So one of those that comes up is a healthy self-esteem. And yeah, I mentioned that an inflated self-esteem can actually be part of the social dominance theory, right? That white supremacy holds people at the top. That's not healthy self-esteem, right? That's self-esteem based on group membership rather than a healthy self-esteem that would be self-esteem that's based on positive attributes that the person has, right? That things that I get my healthy self-esteem from acknowledging things that I'm good at, for example, right? My strengths as a person, my strength of character, the things that I'm good at doing. It not from simple belonging to a particular group, right? So healthy self-esteem can promote a reduction of prejudice and discrimination. Counter stereotypic imagery can reduce prejudice and discrimination. And going back to that unfamiliar groups, when groups are unfamiliar, so if I'm a person who has never interacted with someone of a particular racial group, my ideas about that group are completely based on the stereotypes that I have. And my stereotypes are based on what I've seen in the media, right? What I've seen on TV, what I heard on the radio, or if I've never interacted with a group, that's where my stereotypes come from. So if we have counter stereotypic imagery that can help to disrupt that, right? It helps to disrupt that idea. This is why it's so important for us as a college to look at the images that we put out, right? What are the images that we have on our web pages? When we are marketing a particular program, are the students white, all white in that particular program? It's something that I am very sensitive to as an instructor when I look at my curriculum and my textbooks. Do my textbooks have diverse imagery in them? The videos that I show, do the videos that I show have diverse imagery? I have a particular video that I think is a wonderful video on study strategies, but all of the people in the video are white. They're animated, so they're caricatures. They're all white, and the people in power in the video, so it has teachers and students. I think it might also have some employers. But all of the people in power are men, and everybody in the video is white. So I had to really think about whether or not to use that video. I still use the video, but then I talk about that. So I use the video as an opportunity to talk about study strategies, and then I also use the video as an opportunity in my class to talk about stereotypic imagery and white supremacy and the erasure of people of color in things like our curriculum and our videos and those kinds of things. So it's important to have that counter stereotypic imagery so that we're not always just confirming our biases, we're seeing people as being in the diversity that they are. Equal status contact with common interests in pursuit of common goals. This is probably the one that has the most research to back it up. And that is that prejudice and discrimination reduce when you put people into, they're in equal status and now they're working toward a common goal. So this might be in the classroom, students working toward a common goal, or it might be in business where employees are working toward a common goal. What doesn't work to reduce prejudice is when there's a status differential. So the boss who has a diverse workforce underneath him or her is not likely to reduce prejudice and discrimination against those groups. If they already have ideas about those groups, that's not necessarily going to help to reduce it, because they're at the top of the hierarchy. So if they have this idea that African Americans are less intelligent, even if they have this whole workforce of African Americans, they're not necessarily going to elevate them in the mind of the white employer. What is likely to help reduce prejudice and discrimination is in the workforce itself. So if you've put together now people of various races in the workforce, now they're working together toward a common goal, the prejudice and discrimination within that group is likely to reduce as they're working together. And that can happen in the classroom as well, right? So if I put students together who wouldn't necessarily choose to work together, and now they're working toward a common goal, then they're going to start to interact with each other as a group, right? So now they've become an in-group, and that minimizes that in-group, out-group, us versus them mentality. Oh, that's what I just said. Right? It recategorizes us and them to we. We are now working toward this common goal. We don't really, I think, at least for me, I'm just speaking for me, we don't like to think that we need to have laws and regulations in order to force us to reduce prejudice, but the literature shows that changing laws and regulations, it takes some time, but it does work to reduce prejudice and discrimination. And part of that is because it forces people to work together, right? So when you force people to integrate and now to collaborate with people that they wouldn't normally collaborate with, even though they were forced to do it. So this is where people who are kind of naysayers about changing laws and regulations, they'll say, well, you can change the laws and regulations, but that's not going to change people's attitudes. It does. It does change people's attitudes. We talk a lot about changing people's hearts and minds, but if you're really going to make a difference in reducing discrimination, you have to change people's behavior. And people's behavior can be forced to be changed. So you force their behavior to change, you force them to interact, and the attitude change will follow. Or particularly if you create a we situation, right? Not if you have still have a hierarchy, but when you create a we situation, then behavior will change, and as a result, people will interact more and see their common humanity, and that will change the social norms. And there will also be pressure to conform to those new social norms. And so you get shifts in attitude over time as a result of that. Empathy. So we need to listen to each other's stories. We need to believe their stories and join in the conversation to experience our common humanity. I think that for me last night, listening to the Stand With Asians presenters tell their stories, that really helped me to understand that perspective, right? That Asian American perspective. And I really like Carl Rogers' definition of empathy. He talked about taking a profound interest in seeing the world through somebody else's eyes. So a lot of times when we define empathy, we say the latter part of that definition, which is just to try to see things the way that other people see things, or walk in their shoes. Sometimes you'll see that. But Carl Rogers talked about we have to take a profound interest in seeing the world through somebody else's eyes. So that means being willing to listen to their stories and believe their stories. And I have that underlined because when I hear people who are resisting all of this talk about anti-racism and white supremacy, and who are kind of resisting that, a lot of that resistance, I think, comes in not believing the stories of people of color, minimizing those stories. We need to take a profound interest in seeing the world through other people's eyes and believe what they're telling us about their experience. And that means also developing a sensitivity to notice inequities, right? Now that I have taken the time to see the world through other people's eyes, I can now notice inequities that are in the world, right? I'm really sensitive to the things that I expose my students to, right? When I look at a new video, I try to think of, okay, how would African American male student perceive this? How would a Asian American gay male perceive this, right? So all of those intersectionalities of social identity, to try to notice the inequities and then call them out. So I think that's the last part, adopting an anti-racist approach. And adopting an anti-racist approach means that we're willing to look at ourselves and call ourselves out, right? To be mindful that they're called unconscious bias for a reason, right? Because they're not conscious biases. So we all have them. So I have to be willing to watch for those, look for those, examine those as they come up. I have to be willing to allow other people to kind of call me out. And then I have to be brave enough to have those conversations with other people, right? To be able to say to other people, this is what I heard you say, and this is how it felt to me, or how I interpreted that, and maybe that's not what you meant, but this is how I reacted to it, and have a conversation around race and racism in an open and vulnerable way. We hear a lot about cultural competency, and I really like to think more about cultural humility, that I'm never going to be 100% culturally competent, right? That's never going to happen. But I hope that I will always maintain my cultural humility, and that is my ability to recognize that I don't know everything, and that I'm always learning, and that I'm open and willing to learn. Questions, comments, reactions, because now I'm just babbling on.
Thank you,
Great.
Marianne. Oh, sorry, was that Susie that was going to talk?
I'm going to say raised hand is still enabled. So if you want to share something, please do so.
Yes.
But I have something to share. We need to develop a sensitivity to notice inequities. I was in a meeting yesterday for professional development coordinators throughout the state. There was a meeting to listen to candidate statements for the board. And one of the candidates withdrew herself because she goes, as I'm looking at all of us, we're all so white. And there's some candidates that are people of color. And I'm withdrawing myself to give those people the chance. And I was just amazed, and I was blown away, because I thought, God, how can I get there? Does anybody have anything they'd like to share? Just go ahead and raise your hand. Anna?
In regards to like reducing prejudice, while I was working at the bookstore, I had a temporary employee, just a seasonal, react in a way to a conversation we were having about kneeling for the national anthem. And she said, so good for them for disrespecting their country. And the question that I always try to ask people when they say something like that is, well, why do you believe that? So us just sitting there and asking her that question and like asking deeper questions of like, okay, well, why do you think that? Well, why do you think that? We ultimately got to her admitting she had one Black person in her life. And that was somebody who was, her boss, so to speak. So I don't think that prejudice is a problem. So here we were sat, all these people of color sat in this room with her, and we're just like, okay, well, let us give you examples of, and like, let's make this tangible for you. So whenever people ask me like, okay, well, how do you even like start that conversation? I'm like, you always just have to ask them, why do they believe that? Because sometimes they may not even realize where that comes from either. Like you said, it's an unconscious bias. So it doesn't have to be something where we get upset of like, how dare you say that about them? It's like, okay, well, you have this belief. Let's try to unpack that and see why you do.
Yes, help me understand that is really powerful. Yeah, instead of reacting really negatively or defensively or in anger, to reply back with really like, help me understand that. Yeah, where does that come from? Why do you believe that? Tell me more, right? And then listening, and that can lead you to a place where you wouldn't have got to if you reacted just with anger.
And
Nice.
Kimberly has something to share, and then we'll let Andrea close us out. Kimberly, go ahead.
The thing I have a problem with is that I've run into so.
Oh, I think you're muted now. I don't hear you anymore. Or is that just me?
Sorry, that was me.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I messed up.
The problem I run into, I mean, what Anna said, yes, that can work. I run into so many people who don't know why they believe that and have this circular logic thing going.
Yeah.
And you can't push back past that. They are so convinced of it, that the people are bad and wrong and this and that. And it's not just like on racial, but on political, on hierarchical. If I'm pronouncing that correctly, probably not, because I'm fumbling over it. It feels hopeless sometimes. You keep hitting your head against that brick wall of them not wanting to even consider that there's another point of view, let alone that their point of view might be wrong.
Yeah. This is not a story. I think that, oh, we're okay for time. This isn't related to race, but I want to tell this story to hopefully give a little hope with this, because we never know the impact that a conversation has on a person, right? We really never know that unless we have the opportunity to circle back. And sometimes it means circle back and circle back and circle back. What you reminded me of was a class session that I had many years ago. I taught a class that ended up being really small. There were like 12 students in the class. So we sat in a circle, and it was personal and social adjustment. It's a psychology class. And we were talking about homosexuality. And this returning male student, he was in his 30s, white male student, said if he had a gay son, that he couldn't handle that he would not want to have anything to do with his son. He got really like upset with it, and the people in the group were trying to convince him that that wasn't true, you know, and they got in this kind of argument, and some people got really upset, and then the class was over, right? And so then everybody leaves, and I was trying to interject a bit, and everybody leaves, and I left there feeling really defeated and hopeless, and like I didn't do a good job managing that discussion. And when we returned the following class period, it was a new topic, and we sat in a circle, and I introduced the new topic, and he raised his hand and he said, "Can I say something first?" And I said, "Of course you can." And he said, "I went home and I couldn't stop thinking about that conversation that we had. And I couldn't stop thinking about, there was a particular student who was really pressing him about if that were your son, you know." He said, "I couldn't stop thinking about it. And finally I realized that if my son told me he was gay," and this was a 30-year-old man who didn't have any children. He said, if my son told me he were gay, I would just love him." And we all went like kind of like that. And it was this like really redeeming moment for me, like, you know, you don't know the impact that these conversations have, because he could have really easily chose not to raise his hand and share that with us. But he did, and it was very genuine, very heartfelt. You know, so you just don't know. And it might not be, that was one conversation. It might take 10 or 12 or 100 conversations to change somebody's mind. But I think that we can't give up that hope. When we give up hope, you know, then it takes a toll on us.
Yes, thank you to Anna and to Kimberly for those comments. I think what Anna shared, it reminded me of something that we've also learned during some of the professional development activities we've had, where you're not calling this person out, right? You're kind of calling them in, like, let me understand how you know, what your thinking is, or tell me, you know, why you feel that way. And so I really like that. And for Kimberly, I think we share some frustrations about that as well sometimes. And like Marianne said, it could take a toll on you, right? If you try to really kind of push it or to understand. And some of these strategies that she talked about here, like recategorizing from us and them to we, focusing on the common or the shared goal of whatever it is you're doing. Sometimes you have to, I think, just step back and go, okay, maybe we aren't going to get through with that. It takes that introspection that Marianne talked about for that person. And maybe it'll happen slower than we want it to, but, you know, we just keep trying, like she said. So, really good strategies here. I think for me, one of the ones I liked is the empathy, listening to the stories of others and believing their stories. I'm guilty of it in different offices that I've worked in. Sometimes you don't believe everything that students say. And as a classified professional, I think that we need to remember it's not our place to judge or our place to assume. And we really, if that's what that student comes in with, you know, with the story or the experience or whatever it is, we take that at what it is and we still help them with whatever it is that we're doing. So, and we recognize if there is, you know, if that person comes from a different background than us, or we have that unconscious bias. So I know that some of these strategies I'm definitely going to continue to use and use more, Marianne. So thank you very much for your presentation. We've got about 5 minutes left here. So again, if we have anybody who wants to chime in or share or ask a question, we have Mary Ann here. But while we're doing that, Mary Ann, can you just give a quick plug about the racial equity labs for our
Yes.
classified professionals? Thank you.
I would love to do that. I would love to, yes. So the RAM Racial Equity Lab grew out of EIFL, which was the Interdisciplinary Faculty Equity Lab. I was the facilitator for that. So we had faculty who were a cohort and were talking about how do we create an equitable teaching and learning environment for our students. And what grew out of that was this idea that we're RAMs, right? We all touch students in a certain way, right? We all interact with students. So it's not just in the classroom, but also as classified professionals, you interact with students. And even if you don't interact with students, the work that you do has an impact on students. So I am in the fall going to have a cohort of classified professionals for the RAM Racial Equity Lab, and we'll be talking about your role as classified professionals in student success and particularly in achieving racial equity. So what are the things that you can do in order to help us as a campus have equitable outcomes for our students? And it will be, now I don't remember how many sessions there are. I think it's 5 2-hour sessions plus some blended sessions. So it'll be 5 2-hour sessions of just classified professional, and then 2 additional 2-hour sessions where the groups will be blended. So we'll have a mix of classified professional, faculty, and management talking about what you're learning in your labs and how the roles overlap. What makes the lab different from like what we're doing right now, which is more didactic, learning about something. What makes the labs unique is that we'll be talking about a particular topic, like maybe white supremacy or white fragility. And then we'll be talking about how that applies to your work. And then you'll go out and you'll kind of practice what you've learned and then come back and talk about how what you learned had an impact on your work, and maybe you tried something new, right, in the way that you interact with a student or the way that you interact with a colleague based on what you learned in the lab. And now you can report that out to the group, and we can have discussions about how to apply what you're learning and actually go out and apply it, and then talk about what that was like to apply it. And instead of just, kind of going to webinars and learning new information and not having a space to really process it and apply it and really work on making changes and all that, the introspection that's required to make that change. That's what the labs are for, right? To create a brave space to really walk the journey together.
Thank you. And if you're interested in becoming part of that first cohort, talk to your manager first, and then also you can email Carrie Ibarra, and Susie posted it in the chat there. So thank you again to all of our attendees and our presenter, Mary Ann, for taking this time to speak with us. Stay tuned for our next sessions that will be coming up in the next 2 months. Check out our emails and our webpage that we have there for professional development. Enjoy the rest of your Friday and your weekend and your spring break if you plan on taking time off. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.